The week didn't turn out the way that I thought it would. I knew for the last couple weeks that John chapter 2 would be where we would be studying from today. And I certainly want to talk about Jesus cleansing the temple. I thought that that would be where we would spend the majority of our time, and it very well may be. But as I dug more and more toward the beginning of John chapter 2, maybe because I just assumed we would go toward the end, I felt really convicted about several things in the first part of John chapter 2. So I want us to go through and read a little bit, and then I've got a couple of questions that I want us to talk about. So John chapter 2, if you want to pick it up with me, we'll read the first couple of verses anyway. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, this is the first of many stories, not only in the Gospel of John, there are a lot in the Gospel of John, but really in a lot of the other Gospels as well. This is the first of many stories that suggests that Jesus was always welcome at a party. He was always welcome amongst people who were having a good time. Jesus was always welcomed into the hospitality of other people. Do you think just maybe off the top, off the surface, that says something, or there's a principle there that would be good to consider? I'm asking the question, so I think there probably is. Jesus was always welcome at a party. What do you think that suggests? People liked him. That's really basic, but it's the truth to a great extent. Yeah, I think so. The presence, in fact, I want to talk about that here in just a few minutes. Jesus had a presence about him. We can make some assumptions about that presence that I think are pretty safe to make, that he was encouraging and he was loving, specifically to folks like he's interacting with here. But we can make some observations about the presence of Jesus that I think are valuable to make. But Jesus got along with people, generally. This story kind of is going to go back and forth a little bit because we're going to see some folks toward the end that he didn't get along with as well. But Jesus was willing to be with people. Now, it's a different time. The hospitality codes that exist during this period of history are such, it's really hard for us to wrestle with and grapple with and understand all of their significance. But there was no party like a wedding party. Just didn't happen. No party like a wedding party in the ancient world. And to a great extent, that's the truth for us today. There's reciprocity within towns and villages where you really had to invite everybody, and to the level that you hosted and to the level that you were successful at making people feel welcome and being hospitable to people, then in their time they would do the same to you, which I think sets up the stage for the dilemma that comes here in just a couple of verses. So Jesus was invited into this party. Now, Cana is not his hometown. Cana is not his regular place of operation. I think that really speaks to both the presence of Jesus and the welcoming nature of Jesus. If it was in Nazareth, if it was someplace else, I think you really could just say, okay, well, he's at the party because of the hospitality codes. But because he's in a place that he's not normally I think that speaks to something about his character and also the character of others. Any other principles there that you think would be worth noting? I think the fact that Jesus was invited to this wedding has a couple of implications. First, as we talked about, the kind of man that Jesus was. I think maybe on a higher level than that, the invitation to this wedding says something about the presence of Jesus at weddings, that he's blessing this marriage, whoever it is that's getting married. Spurgeon says Jesus comes to a marriage and gives his blessing there that we may know that our family life is under his care. I mean, he's saying something about marriage. I think that's worth noting. I think maybe more spiritually speaking, the invitation of Jesus to this wedding says something about what happens when we invite Jesus into our lives. It's never wrong to invite Jesus. It's never wrong to invite Jesus into a place. Text says, go ahead, David. Not fully. They did. It's a little foggy. The timeline on some of this is a little foggy, and we just have to admit that. We don't know what certainly everybody in Cana didn't know. And certainly, maybe even the folks that put on the wedding feast wouldn't have known. His mother knows something. She knows something, and probably the disciples know something. John chapter 1, I mean, he's already ushering disciples to his side. People are making some confessions about him. They know something. They're beginning to talk. That's right. And I think that's an important point, because while they're beginning to talk, they still don't fully know what's coming. And they can't. How could they? And so I think that kind of sets the stage for a little bit of this miracle. There's no mention of Joseph. Don't know the explanation for that, other than most scholars suggest that Joseph probably had passed on by this point. Maybe that's why Jesus had spent so long in Nazareth preparing for his ministry, because just functionally he was taking care of his family, certainly his mother. The wedding had no wine. If you look back at the third verse, when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me?" How does that word woman sound to us? Disrespectful. If you called your mom a woman, what would she say? Excuse me, that's right. That's really not what it was in this time. The word that Jesus used is really hard to translate, probably lady, which still kind of sounds strange in our vocabulary. But it was a term of endearment, and it was a term of respect. Mary said, "They've got no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? Why are you asking me?" And her mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says, do it." Running out of wine was a major social mistake. Big deal. Wine's was not the same as it is now, and that's a whole different discussion that I don't care to have necessarily. But it's different then than it was now. They mixed it differently, and the viscosity and all that. The levels of alcohol were different, but wine existed in basically every social setting. Certainly at a place like this, for a celebration like this. And so it was a major deal for the folks to run out of wine. It either represented a lack of planning and preparation, or it represented something that was difficult to admit, that maybe some of these folks that put this party on were lower on the socioeconomic status. I read one thing this week that I thought was interesting. It very well could be, we don't know, but just maybe a plausible tidbit to think about, that it could be that because Jesus is there and the disciples are there at Cana in a place where they're not normally stationed, that maybe they put over the top the number of people that the folks planning the party had put on, which is why Mary went to Jesus. Ultimately, I don't know, but Mary knows there's something about Jesus that's very different. For you to run out of wine at a wedding, for you to break the hospitality codes, was a big deal. At the very least, it would have caused a great amount of disgrace to come upon a family, on a person, to run out of something as basic as what people drink. Wine and water. That's what they had during this period of history. And so Mary senses, or she knows, something's going on here, and she comes to Jesus and she says, they have no wine. Don't know why specifically she came to Jesus, why she sent for Jesus. It's not wrong for Mary to sense that the time had come for her son to enter into public ministry. She would have known, I'm certain, that he had been baptized by John, and would have heard that his baptism was accompanied by a heavenly sign. Mary would have known that Jesus had been tempted in the desert, and she would have known, at least on some level, that Jesus was called the Lamb of God, which we read about in John chapter 1. Jesus speaks back to her with this term of respect. He doesn't call her mother. He calls her lady, he calls her woman, he calls her something that is difficult for us to translate, but he doesn't call her mother. You think there's an implication there? I don't think it just happens. I think everything there is for our benefit. That he doesn't call her mom, mother, whatever. What could the implication of that be? That he uses a more formal, distant, respectful title.
Well, later, when people came to him and said, your mother is outside, your family is here, and he said, who is my mother? He's trying to make the break from, I've got handwritten in my notes, it was time for him to separate from his family.
Yes. Yes.
Later at the cross, he refers to her as woman.
Yes, he does. There's a sense, a real sense here, that the relationship is changing. Not his love. In fact, from the cross, when he calls her that, he still ensures that she's taken care of. He doesn't love her less than he did from one moment to the next. But there's something, I think, that is signified here, that this relationship is changing. And maybe more than the relationship changing is the levels of importance in Jesus' life are changing. That's what he's representing. I mean, obviously, Jesus always had perfect order in life, but there's something, I think there's something worth digging into when it comes to us, and it's time for us to do ministry or to serve or to grow spiritually. That comes to the front and everything else comes to the back. Even the relationships with our very own family, should they limit what it is that God is calling us to do. And I think what Jesus is representing here, and what he represents throughout his whole life, is the ability to pursue his Father, to be obedient, to let nothing stand in the way of that, even the closest relationships that he had while also continuing to honor those relationships. That's a very difficult thing to do at times. It's in one sense, it's very difficult to put relationships to the side if they limit our relationship with the Father or stepping out into obedience. In another sense, it's easier to do that by breaking those relationships and step out into faith and step out into obedience. It's very difficult to do both, and Jesus does both. He continues to honor people. He continues to be respectful to his mother, but while also signifying that this relationship has changed. I think what you said, the connection that you made when his family comes and Jesus says, my brothers and sisters are those that do the will of God, it's the same kind of thing. And the fact that it happens multiple times in the ministry of Jesus isn't just by chance. There's something for us there to respect and honor, but also to put first things first. And that's a very difficult thing, I think, to do. Spiritual growth is at stake. We have to align life, even the relationships in our family accordingly. He says, my hour has not yet come. The expression generally is used in John. He says it a lot throughout the Gospel of John. Generally, it's talking about his death. My hour has not yet come. A fixed, appointed time for Jesus to die. This is an exception to that. Mary says, whatever he says to you, do it. Not a lot of recorded words from Mary in the New Testament. When she talks, it's probably worth noting. And she says, whatever he says, do that. So let's pick up in verse 6. There were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish rites of purification. Don't know that the number is significant. Some people find significance there. There would have been bowls on the tables that the Jews would have washed their hands in order to keep the law, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called to the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you've kept the good wine until now. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples and stayed there for a few days. Jesus says, draw some out, take it to the master of the feast. We don't know when the miracle happened. Maybe it happened right there in the jars, in the pots. Maybe it happened as they poured. It doesn't matter. The miracle happened. He turned water into wine. What's interesting to me, what kind of drew my attention, is that Jesus looks at the servants and he says, well, what did he say to the servants? What do you want the servants to do? To fill the water up. To fill it. And what did they do? They filled it all the way to the top. They filled it all the way to the brim. I think this took faith, some level of faith on behalf of the servants. Imagine when Jesus then says to the servants to go and give it out. Imagine what the master would have said if the servants had brought him water. They know something is taking place. They know that something is happening, and Jesus takes, or the servants take all this out and give, and it ends up being better than the first. What do you think the principle is that the wine that Jesus makes is better than the wine they had to begin with? Is there a principle there? Charles Spurgeon says the best is yet to come. And in what I read this week, I I think that's a really powerful lesson that the best is yet to come. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the temple, and starting in the 13th verse, and then I will spend the rest of our time here. This is a story that's always kind of drawn my attention. Yeah, Chet.
So, as you were talking about the relationship with Jesus and his mom, I was thinking about my mom, who was a nurse, and when I became a physician, really wrestling with, on June 30th, I'm just a student, and then July 1st, I'm a physician.
Hmm.
It was very hard to, when people started calling me doctor, say, who are you talking about?
Sure.
And my mom would, I would hear her talking to somebody about what I had said, and she said, well, I think what Dr. Gentry means is, and that was weird to me because when she was talking to me, I don't think you ought to do this, But a lot of times when we look at Jesus, we say, well, of course he could do that. He knew he was the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
But it says that Jesus was tempted in every way that we were. And I wonder if Jesus felt some of that. I'm just a kid. I just grew up here, and yeah, I'm the Son of God, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know if I'm ready. What am I supposed to do? I don't have any examples. I don't have any.
Sure.
And we are supposed to be, representatives of God. We're all competent to counsel. We're a royal priesthood, but we don't feel ready either.
Hmm.
And I had never thought of
Yeah.
Jesus growing up that way.
And one of the things that scholars wrestle with, people who do that for a living, really think deeply about the text. And one of the things that's been difficult for thousands of years is the explanation and the balance between Jesus as Son of God and Jesus as Son of Man. Certainly, Jesus was not a spiritual robot. And the illusion that you pointed to is a really apt one, that he was tempted the way that we are. What levels of doubt and fear and all that we can't speak to, but it is interesting to me, as you were saying that this first miracle happened with his family around, and that his mother encouraged. What did he know? How did he know the will of God? I can't speak to her answer, but his mom was there, and that's a big deal.
And I don't know, Jesus always had such a keen sense of timing.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout his life, throughout his ministry.
Yeah.
I guess it's hard for us to grapple with it. But I think there's a little hint at the end of this chapter, actually, which we'll get into next, but it says he didn't entrust himself
Right.
to the people.
Right.
Because he knew them.
Yes.
And, maybe that was part of his thinking at the wedding feast as well. It's like, hey, I don't know that I fully trust these people yet
Sure.
to handle what
Yes. I think that's a really apt point, that Jesus, as the end of chapter 2 says, that he didn't trust. There's a big difference, and really the story, the event at the temple speaks to that. There's a significant difference in the kind of person who says, Jesus, I want a miracle. The kind of person who finds it captivating that Jesus can do a magic trick, maybe. And the kind of person who says, okay, based on that, I'm going to lay my life down and I'm going to follow you. And Jesus knows at the beginning, and really even throughout his ministry, that the vast majority of people want the magic show. They don't want obedience. The vast majority of people want the signs that accompany Jesus. They don't want to follow the road that Jesus is on to his death. They want the first part of John 2. Less people want the second part of John chapter 2. Because it is more authoritative in a sense, which is interesting because really the first part of John chapter 1 speaks more to his deity. And you would think that people would think, okay, there is some authority there, but really the way that we interact with that is just wanting the sign. We won't read the whole thing, but let's read a couple of verses, and then I want to talk a little bit about what he does at the temple. One of the points that Mike drew out for us last week was what John 1 does is introduces us to Jesus as God, but also Jesus as man. John 2 does the same thing. Jesus is God. He can turn water into wine. But Jesus is also man. Verse 13, the Passover of Jews was at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem, something that he would have had to have done. And in the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. To make a really long point short, the people who were sitting at those tables were taking advantage of every Jew, but primarily the poorest of the Jews. When you came to Passover, when you came to the temple, and you had to offer a sacrifice, the priest had to say that sacrifice is good enough. And the vast majority of the time, with certain classes of people, the priest would look at the gifts that were brought and they would say, it's not good enough. Sorry. Oh, by the way, you can buy one from us that is good enough. And the ones that you can buy from us are 10 times what it cost you. And so they were profiting off of these sacrifices. They were taking advantage of the poor. And so they were also set up, most people say, right inside the court of the Gentiles. They didn't want to do it in their own place. They didn't want to do it in the Jewish quarter. They did it in the area where Gentiles were allowed to come. So you had poor Jews being blocked out or being ripped off, and you also had access to Gentiles being limited. Jesus comes in here, and Jesus is straight up mad. He's angry. You think there's a principle there? Just the fact, if I say Jesus is angry, what's the draw out from that? It's okay to be angry. You ever been angry? It's okay. It can be okay. But also, at times, it's not okay. Jesus, in the first part of John 2, I think this just kind of hit me toward the end of this week. He balances putting first things first and relationships, which we struggle with. But he demonstrates that there's a balance to be had there. Toward the end of John chapter 2, he balances having strong emotions, but doing so in a God-honoring way. Which is remarkable because we struggle with that, don't we? Why is it a struggle to have strong emotions but demonstrate those emotions in a God-honoring way? It's tough. It's tough for me. Why is that hard?
Usually when you're angry, you don't think straight.
No, it's the truth. When you're angry, you don't think straight. You've heard the term see red, or the phrase I saw red. You see red, you don't see much else, do you? What else? Yeah. Emotions are very personal to us. And so when we feel those strong emotions, those tend to kind of take precedent over anything else. There have been major streams of people of religion or faith that have done what they could do to divorce themselves of emotion. Some of that pursuit initially might have been pure, but Jesus isn't interested. God's not interested in us divorcing ourselves from emotion. God made the emotions. He created the emotions. What Jesus represents, though, is how to demonstrate those emotions in a way that honors God. I would say, if you want to have anger, even if we want to pinpoint that emotion because that's what Jesus feels, probably the first most important thing that everything else that we might say would be built on, that Jesus is demonstrating really, really well here. If you want to honor God with anger, make sure you're angry at the right things. You know what I mean? There's a lot to be angry about. Sometimes, we'll talk to folks, and it's like, okay, your level of anger at a 2 or a 3 on a scale from 1 to 10 makes sense. But if you go to a 9, that's not a healthy thing. There are things in this world where we ought to be at a 9 or a 10. And if we're at a 1 or a 2, that means we're apathetic. That means we're indifferent. I don't think God made us to be that way either. But we've got to be angry at the right things on the right level. I think as human beings, if we step back, like away from seeing red, the vast majority of people, and there's people who are imbalanced, certainly, but the vast majority of people can tell you at what level and what's right and not right to be angry about. And so I think God has given us that ability. We just don't use it. We just don't use it.
Sometimes I think it can be seen through how we, perhaps how we deal with our children, in that we can start out with something happens that is upsetting or disturbing, and I think that's wrong.
Right.
But we lose sight of what the ultimate motivation is to be able to teach and train that which is right.
Right.
And so we make it more about correcting the wrong or addressing the wrong, as opposed to stepping back and saying, I don't want to live in that space. I want to teach and train that which is right.
Yes.
So Jesus was angry, but he moved to the greater principle.
Absolutely.
To take them and didn't let the emotion become the issue in and of itself.
Yeah, I think there's a powerful principle there. Jesus went to the greater, not to the lesser. I read somebody this week, and I can't remember who I read this week, that Jesus demonstrated authority, not violence. Now, he took the time to think through it. I don't think Jesus, I don't think he's Indiana Jones and he's got a whip on his side, right? That he whipped people with. And we don't know exactly what that was like. Maybe he was beating the animals. Maybe he was kind of going after some people. I don't know. But he wasn't violent. He was more authoritative. And there's a difference there. And I think, Mike, using our kids as an example is a really good place to go, because while we might not use the terms authority or violence with our kids, certainly we hope not, when we correct kids or anybody by speaking to the bad behavior only, exclusively, we're speaking to that lower level, as opposed to, let's stand on this and speak to the higher ethic and the higher principle. There is authority there. Ultimately, God has authority over all. And so, if we want to redeem anger, I think we've got to do the same. Yes, sir.
So would it be more as if Jesus is separating himself from the human emotion and more of passing judgment at that moment as the Son of God?
There's certainly judgment there. There's certainly a demonstration of judgment in what they're doing. What's fascinating about the ministry of Jesus, and I don't have a great answer all the time, on a high level, if we kind of pull one story out, I do a little better, but on a high level, Jesus expresses this judgment toward religious leaders. He does not express the same kind of judgment toward people who interact with him, who the world calls sinners. And there's some principles there that we're going to hit because John shows this. All the gospel writers show this. But yeah, there's no doubt what Jesus is doing in part is judgment. He takes from he uses God's own authority, the Father's own authority from the Psalms when he says, you've messed this house up. This is what the house was made for, and you've turned it into something else. So there's great authority and judgment there.
Jesus exhibited such a keen ability to pick his fight.
Yeah, he picked his fights. That's great.
That's something certainly I struggle with, probably all of us struggle with, is how to selectively pick your fight.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm making some assumptions here, but Jesus probably, and this is probably not the first time he's been in
Sure.
pissed off with us.
Sure.
But he chose this time to pick this fight, and it was clearly of that level that it was important to him.
Sure.
And I also assume that in the scheme of things, in his, in his plan, that this fit in a
Mhm.
very special way.
Yes.
In that making the statement that he wanted to make at that time. I could be totally wrong.
No, I think you're right. I think two things that you said today that you can kind of build together. He knew he had good timing, and he knew how to pick his fights. Jesus, this isn't a new practice, what he's seeing. Who knows how many times Jesus has been in the temple and how many times Jesus sees this. There's another instance of this that the other gospel writers record at the end of his ministry. It's not the only time he does it. He does it at the beginning of his ministry, and he does it at the end of his ministry. There's some timing there. And there's some demonstration there. And I think an illustration that Jesus is making. I think that's a really good point. Emotions we have. But Jesus demonstrates putting first things first, ordering life in such a way, even those intimate relationships, ordering life in such a way that brings honor to God, but also dealing with the very deep inside parts of ourselves in such a way that honors God. He is the Son of God, but this is possible. And these are the kinds of things that the followers of Jesus do. Hey, thanks so much. We'll pick up in John 3 next week. Appreciate your participation, and thanks. Have a great week.